Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you at the Hamburg Institute for Social Research in order to continue with the Landshut Prize ceremony. As you might know, Michael Savage was awarded the Landshut Prize 2022 by the scholars of the HIS. Last Thursday, Senator Carsten Broster gave a welcome address to the first lecture of Michael Savage, and Professor Monika Krause from the London School of Economics gave a laudatory speech before Savage began with his talk entitled, "What are the challenges of inequality in the 21st century?" Tonight, Michael Savage's second Landshut Prize lecture will analyze elite diaspora, the case of UK non-domiciled taxpayers, which will give us a lot of insights into the peculiarities of the British tax state. For those of you who have not seen and heard Mike's first lecture and the wonderful laudatio by Monika Krause, here a few words about his career. Michael Savage, member of the British Academy, is certainly one of the best-known British sociologists and one of the leading experts in the world on the analysis of social stratification and inequality. After some time as a professor in York and Manchester, at these places very much involved in urban sociology, he moved to London, and since 2014, he is Martin White Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Mike established the LSE's International Inequalities Institute in 2015 and has been, even before that time, a prolific writer publishing many widely cited books and articles. I just would like to mention some of them. There are too many to mention all. In 1992, he co-authored Property, Bureaucracy and Culture, Middle-Class Formation in Contemporary Britain, a big book, I have to say, which was important for me insofar as it was the first one I read from Mike. So that was my first encounter with him. In 2000, he wrote Class Analysis and Social Transformation. In 2010, Identities and Social Change in Britain since 1940, The Politics of Method. And last but not least, in 2021, The Return of Inequality, Social Change and the Weight of the Past, a book published at Harvard University Press and to be published in German by the Hamburger Edition, I think in autumn. You might have seen the picture of the German book cover on the walls outside of the HIS. So we are really looking forward to his second Landshut lecture, in which he probably will also demonstrate that a good sociologist also always has to be a good historian. Mike, please come forward and please welcome Mike Savage.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang, and thank you for coming tonight. I hope you're not getting too much of my speech. I'm just going to call up a PowerPoint. Should be here. Okay. My lecture on Thursday was very general. Okay, I mean a huge topic. Impossible to do justice to. So I thought, as a contrast, today is a very specific topic. I suspect most of you don't really know what non-domiciled taxpayers are. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So this is a very specific, concrete topic, but I'm going to try and use it to elaborate the bigger themes. So there will be a link, I hope, between the ideas I talked about last week and this particular, very, very particular concern around how certain British taxpayers can claim to be a non-domiciled, right? And so this is if you look at the bottom of this slide, every year, most British taxpayers have to fill in a tax return. You have to say how much you've been earning, what your sources of income are. And one of the things you get asked, question 23, is, are you domiciled outside the UK? This notion of domicile I'm going to come back to, but basically it means if you claim to be non-domiciled, this means that you are living in the UK, hence you're filing taxes in the UK, but you are claiming that your permanent home is somewhere else in the world. And if you tick that box, then you can get tax exemptions on income from assets which are kept overseas. Now, my talk today will give, first half will be reflecting upon why the issue of domicile is of sociological interest, and particularly for those of you interested in the sociology of law. I'm not a sociologist of law really, but I have become interested in the law because of this particular issue. And I want to reflect upon the historiography and the significance, the potential significance of this question of non-doms. And then the second part, I'm going to be talking about some collaborative research which I've been doing with 3 colleagues, 2 economists, two of whom are economists, one of whom is a legal scholar, where we have been the first people to go inside the secure data laboratory of the taxation authorities in the UK and find out who the non-doms actually are. So it's a talk in 2 parts. But let me begin though, just returning to the big themes of last week. And these are the ones in my book. And I'm going to try and argue that the non-doms is an exemplification of the big themes which I talk about. So just as a reminder, for those of you who were there last week, and for those of you who weren't there, this is a very simple précis. You know, the point I make in the book is that the return of inequality is driven by the accumulation of wealth. We have seen this huge build-up of wealth assets across the globe in the last 40 or 50 years. And the build-up of wealth is also about the accumulation of past resources. It's about the accumulation of the past as well as the accumulation of capital and wealth. And one of the implications of that is various historical forces which led to the accumulation of wealth around colonialism, imperialism, the expropriation of people from the land, as Karl Marx talked about in the English enclosure movement. Yes, sure, they were in the past, but the wealth which they initially generated is being renewed today. And those initial foundations remain active, and in some respects are becoming reactivated in the basis of contemporary conditions. And one of the implications of that argument is that historically powerful categorical divisions, particularly around gender and race, also class, are being refueled, are being re-energized by this build-up of past forces. So that's the big argument which I tried to discuss last week. And I'm going to try and exemplify it with this particular case study. And I want to begin by just talking to you a bit about the British imperial diaspora. What does that mean? So if any of you know a very famous book produced by Robin Cohen, he was one of the first sociologists to develop the concept of diaspora, which has now become utterly routine, isn't it? The notion of diaspora is now mundane in social science. We are all familiar with numerous kinds of diaspora, labour migration, refugees, and such like, lifestyle diaspora. And yet, Cohen's book, one of the first to talk about this concept, has a chapter to something he called the British imperial diaspora, of which, since he wrote this book, very little has been written. There's a very interesting point that this diaspora has not been discussed in the way that the movement of Jewish, of black, Armenian, Lebanese, etc., diaspora have been. This is what Cohen says about it. Emigration from Britain from the 17th century onwards was one of the highest in volume and one of the longest in duration in the world. The relationship between the British at home and their Dominion diaspora abroad had been cemented by ties of kinship, economic interdependence and preferential trade agreements, by sport, by visits and by tourism, and by the sharing of arms in 2 world wars. It addressed a vital nerve centre in British identity, one that coupled patricianship, eliteness, snobbery, to upper-class pretensions and mannerisms at home. So really powerful arguments about the significance of this diaspora, and yet really, where is the discussion about this diaspora now? It doesn't really exist. To give an example of the scale of this diaspora, this is a very interesting recent piece of work by historian Freddie Fox, who has coined this phrase, the British emigration state. The point Fox is making is to say the British, are obsessed by immigration. If you go into British, it's all about worries about refugees and immigrants and what this is doing to British society. But in fact, for the vast majority of its recent history, Britain has been a net exporter of population. More people leave the UK than come into the UK. And this emigration character of the British state has been institutionalized in all kinds of ways by policies around sending convicts to Australia, trade unions having policies to encourage labour migration, and so forth. And this is a graph which Fox produces comparing the amount of emigration from the UK and Ireland, it should be said, since the 1850s, compared to other European nations. And as you can easily see, the amount of emigration from the UK is vast compared to any other European nation. 20 million people, mostly white people, and come back to this point, mostly white people left Britain in this period of 150 years. Only Italy comes a bit close to that. And of course, the Italian diaspora is well known, and massive discussions about the Italian diaspora. But there isn't a similar discussion about the sheer size of this British diaspora, which spread out to many parts of the world. And as you can also see, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the German diaspora are much smaller, very much smaller by comparison. So here's a really important historical phenomenon which seems to have seems to have escaped from view. Sorry about this slide. Oops. But let me try and talk to this slide, which isn't very clear. I mean, why does it matter? And it matters in a number of ways. And what I'm going to be trying to be arguing in this talk is that the non-dom clause, in a way, is an exemplification of this diasporic mentality, or this diasporic practice institutionalized by the state. So a number of things. One of them is the idiom of the English-speaking people. Okay, so Winston Churchill, famous war leader, had this, he also wrote history books in his spare time, one of which was a whole series of multi-volumed history of the English-speaking people. What did he mean by that? He meant absolutely that he identified the British with the British diaspora as a kind of English-speaking population in the US, Australia, Canada, particularly in what became known as the Dominions, the white settler countries. Also, it's an exemplification of the way in which British problems could be exported, and this comes up time and again. We currently in the UK having the current government policy has a policy around refugees that they should be sent to Rwanda. So, refugees come in and we will shift them out to Rwanda, who will deal with them and process them. That, in a way, you might say is a very distinctive and very odd approach, which is being contested in the law courts, but it's exemplary of this mentality too. That is to say, here's an issue, refugees, how do we deal with it? We export it to another part of the world. We don't address it at home, we externalize it. And the crucial way in which this manifests itself is the way that tensions between the English, Scottish, Irish are often reconciled by being linked to a broader British project, a British imperial project. It also lends itself to a highly racialized conception of what it is to be English-speaking and part of this British imperial diaspora. A book I'm going to return to later in this lecture by Duncan Bell, political theorist at Cambridge, called The Dream Worlds of Race. His argument is that during the 20th century, as the British Empire was losing power, you get the conception of an alternative framing of white Britishness, which is around the notion of the Commonwealth. And he discusses the way that in the middle decades of the 20th century, there was a serious discussion about the US and the UK and the white dominions of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, etc., becoming reconciled into a global Commonwealth, all assumed around a certain kind of white British mentality. Yeah, that is... And what Duncan Bell points to is a number of writers. H.G. Wells, the science fiction writer, who wrote The War of the Worlds, Andrew Carnegie, an American journalist, W.T. Stead, a big American philanthropist, all of whom were kind of committed to this notion of reforming a British Commonwealth, which united US, UK, and these dominions into a kind of global world power, the global world power. And the important point here is that this argument was taking place at the same time that the British Empire itself was under attack. It was an alternative way of understanding the preeminence of Britishness, or the Anglicy, or the English-speaking peoples, if you want, during this period. So I think just these few comments suggest that this is really a really important diasporic formation, which really isn't talked about very much and hasn't really been subject to much attention. Why not? And indeed, you know, despite Robin Cohen talking about it in 1997, very few studies of it since then. Well, one reason that has escaped attention is because it doesn't fit conventional narratives of British society, which is British society tried to shake off its imperial background. It tried to become a modern nation, and particularly with both the Thatcherite revolution, which claimed to be about modernising the British economy and making it, you know, freeing it up of regulation, and the old boy network, along with Tony Blair and the Third Way. This is all part about developing a new British identity, which does not seem to be bound up with these old imperial ties, at least not overtly. So that was one reason why, you know, people stopped talking about this British imperial diaspora. It's also true that many of the white dominions, and the white dominions, or the settler dominions, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Ireland, South Africa, US is a bit different, because it was independent from the 18th century, but nonetheless shares some of the same aspects. All those nations which had historically had policies encouraging white immigration to their countries, and they normally preferentially wanted white British immigrants, but they found that very embarrassing. And during the post-Second World War period, that one by one they began to get rid of that policy. The last, I think, was New Zealand, which abolished that policy in 1971. But until then, that had been deliberately aimed at try and attract white British migrants. And those nations, as they tried to articulate multicultural identities, found this a very embarrassing story too. And they didn't want to emphasise these British links, because that's not really in the interests of their self-positioning as multicultural and global players. So that gets forgotten about. But I mean, a personal story, you know, I was born in 1959, and even, you know, as a teenager in the 70s, I remember, you know, at one point in time, my parents looking at these glossy brochures about emigrating to Australia, you know, about how, you know, you don't want to stay in wet, cold London, but how wonderful it is to be moving to the sunshine, leave your problems behind, get a nice big house. This was the 70s. At that point, Australia had moved to a points-only immigration policy, but it still was marketing migration to, you know, white British middle-class audience. It's very, you know, it's only quite recently that shifted. So there's two reasons why this story has not been discussed. But also, you know, this is a hypothesis, if you like, which I'm going to try and argue for today, is also it reflects the fact that the British imperial diaspora, in a way, has become globally dominant. It's become so dominant that people don't talk about it. It's almost become a kind of normal institution of global power. And hence, the distinctively kind of white British elements of it can get forgotten about. So some examples of this, I mean, the fact that here, you know, English has become the dominant language of business and science and politics is an obvious point, but not often discussed. How did that happen? How did English become this dominant language if it wasn't all part of this power of the global British diaspora? The role of private schooling. The British private schools, which exemplify this model of, you know, elite education, have become very powerful. And many British private schools are now opening up campuses in China, in Japan, in Asia, South America. Most cities have English schools. Some of them lean more to the American model, but significant numbers look more to the English model, and still do. Prestige sports. What are the exemplifications of prestige sports? Many of them have this roots in these kind of English imperial diasporic tradition. Tennis, golf, cricket in some quarters, not everywhere. And again, polo, horse racing, etc. You find this very powerful kind of sports complex around which Britishness is defined, and also in the world of business itself. So I'm just referring to some work done by Felix Bourman from Lausanne in Switzerland and Christoph Ellersgaard from Copenhagen. And they had a very impressive analysis of occupational moves using an international database to try and find out what are the best places to launch a career from. It's what they call global career hubs. And the argument is the best places to get early career experience if you're a rising corporate star is in one of the kind of consulting firms and accounting firms which are dominated by that British model and still are, PwC and Arthur Andersen and all that. So again, no one talks about that, but implicitly still a very powerful force globally, and have become more so, arguably, with kind of neoliberal global capitalism. So this is the kind of argument. Perhaps the British Empire, and this is where the return of inequality comes from, the weight of the past. No one calls it the British Empire anymore, but perhaps the institutional forms which that empire generated are, reviving and becoming more significant agents in the world today. Also, tied in with that argument, rather than understand the Britain as a nation state, which it never has been. We don't have a constitution. We don't have a kind of unified legal system, as I'll talk about in a minute. Perhaps it always has remained an empire, a weak empire, but it still needs to be understood as a kind of imperial formation, which never really got transformed into a modern constitutional state. Giving some examples of that, the Brexit project itself is about kind of renewing, in certain visions, renewing a kind of imperial greatness. We don't need the Europeans constraining and regulating. We can go it alone. This is absolutely the view of some other conservative leaders who argued for Brexit. Kathleen Pistol, legal historian, legal scholar, has written this very interesting book on what she calls the Code of Capital, the fact that capital needs to be institutionally and legally codified in order for it to be operative. And she is very attentive to the particular legal institutions which are differentially valuable for capital accumulating. Many of the ones she singles out as being particularly effective devices for capital to accumulate and build value are associated with the British legal tradition, the British legal common law tradition. Things like the trust mechanism, which is also written about by Brooke Harrington. Trust mechanism was devised during the medieval period when British aristocrats would go and fight the Crusades, and they would leave, because they weren't scared of not coming back and their property being intestate, they would leave their castle or their landed estate in the hands of a trust, with trustees who would then make sure that the estate was passed on to their heirs. So this notion of the trust is a medieval institution, but is absolutely, playing a huge role in contemporary business life, as Harrington talks about. Similarly, Vanessa Ogle, economic historian, has written about the way in which when decolonisation took place after the Second World War, the British helped establish a whole series of tax havens, which were former sometimes our current British colonies, usually small island nations, to play a role in allowing the transmission of, or the global movement of capital. So all these things, massively important for contemporary capitalism, and they all have this historic root in British imperial life. Now, it could also be argued, and here I'm going back to the discussion we had last week about, where is inequality happening? It can be argued that the countries which have seen the most increase in inequality, particularly at the top end, are the ones which have an association with this kind of English-speaking ex-dominion status. And so here I've just pulled out all the countries, USA, South Africa, UK, Australia, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, which were part of these dominion societies. And I've looked at this as the share of the top 1% of the national income. They've all seen, with the exception of Australia, they've all, seen a significant increase in that 1% share. Elites, in other words, are doing really well in these countries, apart from Australia. And the pink line, if you can see that, is the line for continental Europe, which, okay, it's gone up a bit, particularly in the 80s and 90s, but it's really been quite level now. And this is the point that Piketty and many of the economists make, that continental European nations have seen much less of a rise of this 1% than the Anglo nations. So perhaps there's something about the whole British makeup which is actually allowing these elites to resurface and become more significant. An aspect of that, going to this issue of wealth inequality, is the distinctive role of British society, British imperial territories in contemporary wealth extraction. And an aspect of that, which goes back to the tax haven discussion, is to reflect upon which parts of the world are most associated with tax havens. This comes from a campaigning group, and all the territories in blue have a direct link to the British Empire, but actually some of the ones in grey, like Singapore, Ireland, Cyprus, also have a link to the British. So in a way, the British territories, the British imperial territories, are really central to the whole business of offshoring, tax havens and such like. Zuckerman, the economist, he quite correctly emphasises the Swiss banks, which was another really important driver of this, and the Swiss are certainly big players in this, but we should not forget the significance of the British influence. Okay, so you can see the argument, okay? So, are we seeing a kind of revival of this British imperial diaspora? Is it reborn? Is it after a period of being relatively dormant, is it now becoming more powerful as we're becoming more unequal? And also the argument that perhaps to understand Britain, we have to understand it as a kind of imperial territory which lost much of its empire, but didn't fundamentally change its institutional arrangements. And perhaps those institutional arrangements are now allowing the kind of regeneration of these imperial forms. That's that kind of hypothesis. I just want to talk, before I get to the non-doms, I'm going to just try and talk you through a project, which this is where I got the idea from, of this imperial thing. This is a project I did a few years ago with some European collaborators based in Italy, Spain, UK, Romania, Denmark and Germany. And we basically did this project where we look at the transnational ties of citizens of all those 6 countries. There's a book out if anyone's interested in it. I'm not going to discuss all of the findings, but I just want to say a little bit about this finding, which I find very intriguing, about why the British are different from other European countries here. And we asked this question. We did a representative survey in each of the countries. 1,000-odd people, asked them a whole series of questions about, talk us through your international connections, which countries do you know best? We asked this question, are you generally familiar with another country? Which I think is quite a good question at tapping, do people feel comfortable, moving to across borders? And if so, which borders are they? And if you look at this, the columns on the right-hand side, no. The important contrast here is between the southern European countries, Romania, Spain and Italy, where the much higher proportion of people are not familiar with another country. Okay? That's where you find the most kind of insular attitudes, if you like, or non-cosmopolitan attitudes. Britain, by contrast, is much more similar to Denmark and Germany. In other words, most Britons, along with most Danes and most Germans, are familiar with another country. So it's not true that Britain is somehow, isolated, somehow, doesn't have these feelings of attachment to other countries. It does. much more like the Germans. But then we asked this question about, we gave people a series of options. Do you feel you're European? Do you feel you're neither European nor a citizen of the world? You're a citizen of the world, but you're not European. You're European, but not a citizen of the world. Are you European and a citizen of the world? And I just highlighted in red a couple of points of interest. One, and the UK, nearly a quarter of Britons say, yes, we are citizens of the world. Yeah? We do feel we have a worldly outlook, but not European. That Europe place is not part of this. The implication is clearly that it's the imperial territories where the attachments are. Contrast with the Germans and the Danes, where over a quarter say we're European, but not citizens of the world. So that's kind of the Fortress Europe approach, which is, very happy to share a European identity, but that's not broader than that. Now, of course, it's also true that the British score very high. We're on the top about neither being European nor citizens of the world. But I was interested in this finding about attachment to global connections, but not saying you're European. I'm going to skip over these because I'm running out of time. But I hope you get the picture. I hope that project gives a bit of a flavour of some of this argument. So now I'm going to spend second part of the talk talking specifically about the non-doms, right? And explain who non-doms are, what it means, and why they exemplify this argument about the kind of revival of an imperial model, if you like, imperial institutions, and how they may also be driving inequality in the UK, but also globally. So non-doms, just to recap, non-doms are not people who just buy property in London and then live elsewhere. Okay, lots of discussion about very wealthy people from the Middle East buying up expensive apartments in London but never being seen there apart from Christmas shopping and all that. That's a very common refrain. But non-doms are living in the UK for at least 6 months, and hence they have to file a tax return. But what they are saying is, my permanent home is somewhere else in the world. And if they claim that's the case, they are exempted from paying any income on assets, any income derived from assets outside the UK. Whereas if you don't tick that box, if I earn money from any asset I own abroad, I have to pay tax on it in the UK, which is the normal model. Where does it come from? This clause originated from the introduction of income tax in the UK in 1799, when Britain introduced it to fight the Napoleonic Wars. And the implication, why was it introduced? It allowed British elites with, holdings in the colonies not to have to pay tax on those overseas assets. They'd only be liable for tax on their UK assets. So it was in a way a means to allow the elites to gain certain advantages. But it's not just that. It also is it testifies to a mode of power which is, recognises that certain people have extra national interests and they should be taken into account. It is by definition almost an imperialist force. And in this project, we were really keen to explore the ways in which that non-dom phenomenon is still active today. And we were particularly interested in exploring how far are contemporary non-doms still part of this, British imperial constellation. Or by contrast, another argument about non-doms is all to do with the role of finance in the banks. So it represents the particular power of the finance sector in the UK. And there's also an argument about the role of the EU and the significance of the European Union. So I'm going to skip over this. Right. But also, this is where I'm going to digress slightly I'm way outside my comfort zone. I want to say a few words about the legal issue of domicile, because I've become increasingly interested in this. Where does this notion? Most countries don't have a notion of domicile. I doubt you do in Germany. You may have. They do in Switzerland, because there's movement issues about which canton are you domiciled in. But most countries do not have a notion of domicile. You're a citizen or you're not a citizen or something like that. So why do the British have this notion of the domicile? And what we've been doing, myself and a couple of PhD students, and Andy Summers, who's a professor in the law department at LSE, is we've been looking at legal cases historically and looking at the way in which domicile gets used in common law and case law in the UK context. The origins of the domicile issue predominantly come from the fact that when Britain becomes a unified state in 1707, when it absorbs the Scottish, it does not lead to an integration of Scottish and English law. So Scotland retains its own separate legal code. And the issue then becomes, if you're a Scot who migrates to England, what law are you governed by? Are you governed by the law of your birth or the law of England? And the other way around too. It becomes from this lack of constitution, if you like, lack of definition of the British legal system. And it's very interesting that one of the most famous jurists in Britain, A.B. Dicey, who was very, very significant in the later Victorian period, for trying to basically systematize British case law and British common law into a system. So he's normally credited with creating a constitutional monarchy. Legally in Britain, the monarch, all power comes to the monarch. So if you simply follow the law, and it's one application of the law, you'd end up with a authoritarian monarchy. Hence, we are subjects. We're not citizens. What Dicey did is he tried to argue, he tried to demonstrate a way in which case law and common law could be unified in a way which could guarantee what he called a rule of law and Parliament having sovereignty. Interesting, therefore, as part of that project, he wrote a big monograph on the law of domicile, which is kind of interesting because this book is hardly ever cited now. But it's actually, as I say, he devoted a whole major piece of his work to it. And of course, for him, it was very important because it's all about how do you construct a common British law out of Scottish and English law, and also Irish law, which are different. So for him, it's very important. The key thing which Dicey formalised is the idea you get your domicile from one of three things. The default is where you're born. So the default is your permanent home is where you were born. Unless you are dependent on somebody else, and he was particularly thinking of children and wives, completely patriarchal approach to the law. But he also, not just him, but the legal casework which he codified also argued you could make a domicile of choice. That is to say, if the Scottish migrant moved to London and said, I choose to make England my home, then that would be your domicile, and you would be covered by English law. So it's a kind of voluntaristic approach by which a migrant can choose to say that their domicile, their permanent home is elsewhere. So in a way, this is a perfect idea to cover the English imperial expansion abroad, because it allowed white settlers to kind of go to Australia or South Africa or wherever and sort of mentally say, well, by default, I'm still British, but if I choose, if my life really takes off, I can choose my domicile to be Australia. And as this legal scholar Patterson puts it, the more ethereal concept of domicile mirrored the expansion of the British Empire and the desire to ensure that English law continued to apply to Englishmen wherever they resided. Now, the important point is, I think the reason why it is fundamentally an imperial notion is you don't have to seek the approval of the people you go and live with that you belong there. You can declare it. Okay? So it is in a way, it has that notion of entitlement built into it. From the point of view of English law, you can claim I'm domiciled in South Africa, and the English courts would not ask the South Africans their view on it, unless, well, except in extreme situations. It allows the view of the settler to have this power and this significance. Now, I want to talk you this is again quite abstract, I want to talk you through one very extreme example of this and how it works out in Britain today. This is a very extreme example. As I said, we've been combing legal records, which are a goldmine, and we plan to write about this in the near future. This vignette is a bit of a kind of comic vignette in a way, because it's extremely strange, but it gives you a flavour of how people can use the domicile claim in ways which seem entirely implausible, but which can have power. So the issue here is this guy, Nicholas Henderson, claims he is not domiciled in Britain, and hence he should not be liable for some tax obligations. The tax authorities, HMRC is our tax authority, say, don't be silly, you are domiciled in Britain, you're British, please pay your tax like everybody else. And this goes to law, okay, this goes to court. What are the issues here? So what are the grounds Nicholas Henderson uses to say, he's not domiciled in Britain? Well, it turns out his father clearly has a long heritage in the British Army. And his father, Ian Henderson, born in 1930, went to Eton College, which, for those of you who know Britain, is the elite school. It's where Boris Johnson went. But anyway, Ian Henderson does move to Brazil in the 1950s, and he becomes a successful exporter of British product to Brazil, and he becomes a Brazilian citizen and marries a Brazilian woman. And it goes on to say, when he was living in Brazil, Ian Henderson was instrumental in creating a squash court, sport, okay, the link to sport, and the Sao Paulo Jockey Club. So you get the sense here, he's taken the kind of British imperial model to Brazil. And that's where Nicholas Henderson is born, in Brazil. So his birthplace is Brazil. And then in 1966, his father returns to London. And Henderson claims that his father wasn't wealthy, had a family to support, etc., etc., and he was forced back to Britain. He would rather stay in Brazil. That's the way the argument goes. The legal papers say, well, this is very convincing because it's 40, 50 years later anyway. And it turns out he moves to a really big house in the most expensive area of London, Kensington. And his father is still running an export business to Brazil, but this time based in Britain. And the logic probably is they're back for their kids to go to schooling in Britain. So, in fact, Nicholas goes to Eton College again, Britain's elite school. And he goes to Sandhurst Military College, which is Britain's elite military training, and he joins the British Army. This doesn't sound very Brazilian, does it? It sounds pretty British, in all ways. Anyway, he then marries a New Zealander, Sophie Henderson, and they buy an apartment in Switzerland, and their children attend British private schools. And then his career is such that he studies he thinks about studying geography at St Andrews, which is the elite university in Scotland. Serves in the British Army for 20 years. They acquire major London property, and they end up by buying a large country estate in the English home counties, and they renovate it. So, in every conceivable way, it looks like it's British upper crust, British upper class person. But he is claiming all the time that he's Brazilian, and his permanent home is Brazil. And this is what he says: prior to my marriage, I always held on to the belief that I would return to Brazil. My wife is domiciled in New Zealand. My current intention is to retire to New Zealand and also spend time in Brazil. The law court finds in favour of the UK tax authorities, not Henderson. But it's interesting that this came to court, right? And it shows how highly elite individual with all the trappings of British, the British infrastructure of sport and private schools is still claiming that their permanent home is elsewhere. Shows all the links to sport, private schools, the use of trust mechanisms, which I mentioned before, the idea of going to the army, this idea that I might go to St Andrews, which is the classic, elite university. That's where King Charles went, Prince Charles. Similarly, the use of London. They're really concerned to be close to London. Also, the style of justification is very interesting, I think. Just to say, many people think he's just trying it on, really. It's implausible. But the legal papers at the bottom are really quite interesting. And I got really interested in the way you can use legal, questioning to try and, because it can probe people. It's quite telling. And the legal judgment was, we wouldn't characterise his evidence as misleading, since he gave clear and honest answers in cross-examination, which included accepting that he had on occasions overstated methods. In other words, I think he genuinely did believe he was Brazilian. Right? He wasn't just trying it on. He genuinely did believe that really his permanent home was Brazil, even though, as the cross-examination discussed, if Brazil is your permanent home, why have you hardly ever been there in the last 30 years? So the cross-examination found him out, but in a way, it's a style of justification of legitimation, which is indicative of that notion of entitlement. Can we think of other examples of this? A certain British Prime Minister comes to mind. His father, Stanley Johnson, a year or so ago, was awarded French citizenship, which may sound counterintuitive given the fact that he was a strong Brexiteer. But I think this is what Stanley Johnson said, the second quote here. It's not my question of becoming French. I am French. This is absolutely what the notion of domicile gets at. I have the power to say, well, which country I belong to. I don't need to check with people out there. I don't need to ask the French. I just am French. For me, it's a matter of claiming what I already have. It's a sense of entitlement in that, which is exactly, in a way, what the domicile clause institutionalizes and allows to have credibility. So, last 10 minutes is to give you a flavour of who these non-doms actually are. Right? So what we did, and it wasn't myself, it wasn't so much me, it was my colleagues, who I hope I've listed somewhere. David Berger and Aaron Advani are both economists. Aaron is at Warwick and David is at LSE. And Andy Summers is my colleague in the law department. They've done, and particularly David, has done much of the work. So basically, if you're working in a secure environment, because the information is so sensitive and you can't use any named information, you've got to leave your laptop outside, or you've got to leave your internet connection outside the secure environment, and you have to do all the analysis inside the laboratory. You're not allowed to report anything which runs the risk of any individual being disclosed. So we can't actually discuss any individuals, but you are allowed to report aggregates. What you can also do is you can cross-link everyone who claims to be non-dom with other findings from their tax returns, how much they earn. You can link it to other government records, like which nationality they claim to be. And so you can cross-link the kind of people, or cross-associate this information with a range of other things which the government knows about. A very powerful tool. And also, we've been able to look at it longitudinally between 2001 and 2019. I can't report that now because we haven't got full. Everything needs to be approved by tax authorities, but we can actually trace through people's histories of claiming this non-dom status. So we are the first to really be able to say who exactly are these non-doms? Do they matter? And I'm going to just do that in the last 10 minutes. So at one level, these are figures about the number of non-doms, number of people in the UK claiming to be non-domiciled. It's not that many at one level. It's 90,000 a year in 2008 and declines to about 60,000. So you might say it's pretty unimportant. It's not that significant. It's around 0.1% of Brits. Well, one thing we could also do is because we had longitudinal data, we could actually find out people who, so the numbers in dark blue here are those who claim to be non-dom in any 1 year. But you could also link those individuals up to their other tax records and see if they claimed non-dom status at some point in that 18-year period. It's what we call the ever non-doms. So at some point in that period, you claim to be a non-dom. And that goes much higher. We're up to 250,000 now, getting on towards 1% of taxpayers. And it would be even higher because, of course, there's cut-off points at the back before 2001. So there could have been other people who claimed non-dom status before 2001. Now, this is a really important slide. Because what we can now do is we can say, okay, for those who are non-doms, what income are they earning in the UK? And the income levels are along the bottom here, starting at £100,000 to £200,000. That salary, that income puts you in the top 2% of earners. So we've truncated off the average and the poor. Okay, we've just got exceptionally well-paid people here, going up as far as £10 million or more. These are the top few thousand best-paid people in the UK. Once you get to that level, a third of those super well-paid people are non-doms. So if you remember, I talked at the beginning about the British seeing this big rise of top-level inequality. Many of those people who are at this top end are non-doms. This prima facie suggestion that there's a tie-up between the non-dom clause and the growth of inequality. And that reflects the fact that the British labour market, the British economic structure, at the top end, the most affluent end, has a very high number of migrants. So if you look at the bars in black, this indicates the proportion of people in these different income thresholds who are migrants. And once you get above £5 million, it's 40%. And most of those migrants, no doubt being advised by their tax advisors, are claiming to be non-doms as well. So this is really fascinatingly rich evidence that inequality in the UK at the top end is driven perhaps too strong because you can't prove causality, but it has an association with the non-dom status. What we can also do is reflect upon, well, what are the sources of income? One argument is to say the non-dom clause attracts globally rich people who have assets in the overseas country and they move to London, but they leave their assets overseas and they're predominantly kind of rentier class. Actually, it's more complex than that because this graph shows that, in fact, the biggest share of non-doms in dark blue are employees. That is to say, they are working and earning in the UK. They are very high. They're the working rich. The working very rich, you might say. To be sure, in the bottom edges, you find some investors. Those with no income at the bottom, they are the ones who are likely to be these people whose assets are overseas and they're just living in the UK. Because even they would have to report some income. Because if you bring income into the UK, you do have to declare it in your tax return. But it's an interesting model. It's not just the case that these are the global wealthy parking themselves in London to avoid being taxed on it, because they also are the extremely privileged in the British UK labour market. Let me just, and this is where we can also look at the industrial sector in which non-doms work. And this is industrial sector and not occupation, because the tax returns don't include occupation. And this is quite interesting because, yes, okay, so one argument would say all this is due to is the role of the City of London. It's all driven by the fact these people working in big banks, and they're super well paid in these banks, and the banks are very international, and they will then, it just reflects the dominance of London. Even so, that's interesting, that London's dominance as a financial centre may be associated with the rise of non-doms, but in fact it's more complex than that, because, yeah, sure, there's a lot of people working in finance and insurance, but in fact it's reasonably well spread out, including professional, scientific and technical, information and communication, other goods, other services. What is lacking here, apart from a bit on the right-hand side, are people working in the public services. Very few civil servants, very few academics, very few doctors. There are a few. But even so, this is really interesting to make a powerful argument about why non-doms may be very powerful. To give one example of this, there is a hugely disproportionate number of non-doms who are sports people, it turns out. And we can work out from knowing which part of the country they live in that they tend to be, not tend to be, and many of them are, for instance, in South Manchester, and one assumes they are playing for the Manchester football teams. So if you ask yourself this question, why is the British Premier League paramount in Britain, in Europe? Why is it such a powerful, force in global football? One argument would be to say it may well the fact that if you are Ronaldo signing a contract, and you have an agent saying, why don't you sign for Roma? Someone else saying, well, if you sign for Arsenal, you can get this deal on your tax returns, which means you can keep all your assets in Brazil, wherever it is, and not be taxed on them. Whereas if you sign for Roma or for Paris Saint-Germain, you wouldn't be able to do that. So perhaps the global power of British Premier League has its underpinnings in this law. I mean, this is just a speculation, we don't know this. But it's intriguing to think about how this strange, peculiar clause may be very significant. Okay, so which parts of the world do the non-doms come from? This is where the empire link is important, okay? Well, indeed, as expected, many of them are former imperial territories. The darkest in blue here reflect the highest proportionate geographies. And you can immediately see US and India, but also Australia, South Africa, Canada standing out. But also, we should not neglect the role of continental European countries as well, which is also significant. Indeed, if we code all the countries in the world up to a series of groupings, then you can see that around 60% of non-doms link back to a British imperial territory. The ex-dominions, this is the Australia, Canada, South Africa. Other parts of the British Empire in dark blue. India we kept separate, because it's very important, India. The US we kept separate in green. So nearly, well over half of non-doms have this link to British imperial territory in some form. But nearly 40% do have a connection to Europe, both the old Europe, the EU6, and the more recent parts of the European Union. Much discussion about the role of Russian oligarchs and Middle Easterners. In fact, there are a few of those. The yellow, so Japan is the yellow, and the dark red is the ex-Soviet countries, and then China is in pink. Yes, they matter a bit, but they're not as significant as the media stereotypes would have it. So interesting. So it's there is a strong imperial connection, but also linking into the European connection. Final part, where do they live within the UK? They live overwhelmingly in London. So this is another issue about the return of the past, the return of the city-state. This is very much a London phenomenon. In some areas of London, 10% of residents are non-doms. But for much of the country, there's none at all. They don't exist. But even within London, you find this incredible concentration in the central parts of London. And in particular, and these, for those of you who know the London geography, the dark blue is the richest areas of Kensington and Chelsea, where up to 10% of residents can be non-doms. So thinking about London as a microgeography also links into this macro geography. Final slide is we also were able to look at the kind of national affiliation of non-doms from different parts of the world. And what's interesting is the central zones of London. The modal category of the non-doms are from the EU. They're not from the empire. And that reflects to a large extent, we think, the fact that there's an infrastructure of French schools and German schools and so forth in different parts of London. So it is a story about empire, but also recognising the significance of the EU and European integration up to a point. Conclusion. So I hope I've persuaded you that non-doms are certainly very peculiar, but they're peculiar in sociologically very telling ways. And they exemplify this story about the rising significance of imperial forms. They're a very small group, but we can't just say they don't matter because they're very small, but they are very significant at the top ends of the income distribution, which we know in the UK has pulled away massively in recent decades. They also reflect the way in which a very old institutional device, the non-dom clause, or not non-dom clause, but the notion of domicile, has been recharged in the context of contemporary neoliberal capitalism. This returns to the point I made at the beginning, that they testify to the fragility of UK as a national society, because what they testify is that a certain kind of imperial diasporic elite using the non-dom clause is doing very well, living in central London, extremely well paid, but it's not clear that that has greater buy-in from British society more generally. And it suggests that the UK continues to have this very significant role as a kind of central axis of global elites, linking a number of networks, the Anglo-imperial one, but also the European network, and increasingly the significance of Asia with the rise of Indian and Chinese non-doms. So, thank you very much. Thank you.